Good evening and welcome to the Greg Tompsett Sports Show. You are joining us this fine Friday evening as we dive into a little bit more of some of the fun off-season things going on. We got an NBA Finals going on right now. I think the Nuggets are already thrashing the Heat as we see heading through here at the opening part. But tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about something that is a big passion of mine. I've been a huge fantasy football player for 30 years running now since I was a teenager. And one of my favorite events is a long running league with all of my college friends and guys that I started working with just out of college. We've been in the same fantasy keeper league for 18 years running now. It's one of my favorite things on earth, getting everybody together every year to draft. And as we're getting ready for that, we're going to meld two of my favorite things here tonight, talking about the Buffalo Bills and fantasy football. And who better to help us out with that than Cover One's own Chris Chous, the leader of our fantasy channel. Chris, how we doing?
What's going on, man? Thanks for having me on. I'm on the Greg Tompsett show. This is great stuff.
I appreciate you, man. It's been a lot of fun. You've been grinding your way through building up our fantasy channel. It's been fantastic. And I know, we did a lot of time recruiting, trying to pull you over from your previous works. Let the people know a little bit about how you got into this space and how you started building yourself as a fantasy content creator.
Yeah, so I mean, like you, I've been in the fantasy thing for God knows how long, 25 plus years. And one day I always had a passion for writing and, covering sports. I used to write newspapers for my pops when I was like 12 years old. So, I mean, it was always in my blood to be something of a sports journalist. So one day I just said, you know what, I believe it was 2016. I flirted with the idea of, starting my own company. It was called All Day Football. Kicked that off, made it into like a blog, and it started my own audio podcast, and then it morphed, and I started with the Fantasy Headliners, stayed with them for approximately 4 years, did some good stuff over there as well, and then I'm coming over here. I mean, what a better marriage than being with the Buffalo Bills and talking fantasy sports. I mean, that's why I'm over here, because these guys are awesome here.
Yeah. So we're excited. We're gonna have some fun with it tonight, and obviously, I'll have it linked here for anybody who's not checking it out. We have our Cover One Fantasy Football and Gambling channel going. All kinds of awesome videos. Chris does both draft work and kind of melds that into football, so you can really get into the dynasty space and some of those crazy long-term developmental leagues and stuff like that. And when you get into some of the college guys coming in and everything that goes along that way, so a lot of really good stuff to check it out. And what we're going to do tonight is be able to talk about some of the things you guys have heard Aaron and I talk about more from the on-field football side of it. Aaron and I don't get into a lot of the statistical analysis on that side of it and how it impacts fantasy. But some of the work that I've been doing as we're getting ready for those shows and talking about some of the pieces, I really thought that it would be a great way to kind of bring Chris in and talk a little bit about, hey, how is this going to impact guys as a lot of Bills players? I know this for sure. For a long time, it was kind of hard to be a Bills fan and benefit from it in fantasy. It was always a joke. Like sometimes you would go into the double-digit rounds before our first guy got drafted. And now it actually is fun. Where having Buffalo Bills players can benefit you, and you can actually help win in your fantasy league because you have fantasy players. It's a very novel experience. I'm trying to enjoy it as much as I can.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I mean, it was a long struggle for us Bills fans forever to have any. I mean, how can you not marriage fantasy football with your favorite team, and they're scoring your fantasy points, you're winning in your leagues, and it's your favorite team? It's absolutely beautiful.
So obviously that starts nowhere better than Josh Allen. Josh Allen is now I think, universal top 3 fantasy quarterback, and many people have him at number 1. I think that he's in that top tier, however you structure it with. I think most people have it with him, Patrick Mahomes, and Jalen Hurts, and I think that's a pretty healthy group. And whether you have Lamar in there or where Burrow and Herbert and other guys of those come into that realm, Josh is definitively there. I'm going to ask you first, how concerned are you in how much discussion there is about him protecting himself, him not taking as many hits? I don't think there's any possibility that he's going to stop running. That's going to be a big part of his game. He's always going to have that there. So my question to you is, how much running can he dial back and have it not knock him out of that top tier?
Yeah, it's funny because we've had this discussion before, I think in the group chat, where I said, I personally feel that as a Bills fan, I don't want us to rely on Josh Allen. I want him to be that X factor on the ground. And when we compare, I did some breakdown, because let me break it down and preface it first by saying, in fantasy football, everyone typically looks at, total points for and then average points per game. And they say, well, that's why I'm picking the guy. You got to look a little further past that. And I love, next gen stats. We see total air yards, etc. But I've developed a model over the past 5 years that, is building on consistency rates. And I think I've kind of developed it kind of like a stock market. So you're seeing the peaks and valleys, the dips and trends, and you can pick up on this stuff. So when I compare the three, Allen, Mahomes, and Jalen Hurts over the 3-year span, we can see Josh Allen has been ranked number 2 this past year, number 1 in 2021, number 1 in 2022. So you're seeing Josh Allen. We go back to 2020, and let's talk about the rushing aspect of it to get to your point on how concerned should we be. Josh Allen ran the ball 102 times, 421, and 8 touchdowns. He still was the first quarterback in all of fantasy football over Patrick Mahomes, who was number 4, and Patrick Mahomes lost 25.2 points on Josh Allen that season, right? So we're talking this season, this past year, Josh Allen was number 2, Patrick Mahomes was number 1, and Patrick Mahomes 428.9 points, where Josh Allen 412, and he missed out on that top piece by 16.7 points. You can see consistency rate numbers for Josh Allen this past year, 82%, where Mahomes was 88% consistency game by game. The problem is with Josh Allen was the turnovers. Am I concerned, that the rushing aspect, if we dial it back by, say, 20 carries, and he goes down to 100 carries this year, rushes for approximately 400, 500 yards, if the TD upside goes away from 8 to like 4 or 5, he's only going to lose that fraction of points. But you're going to see in the retrospect, his passing upside should increase if we're leaning on running backs that much more to take pressure off. Perhaps the play action pass gets better. And I think efficiency rates could go up higher for Josh Allen.
I like that a lot. And the one you brought up is really where my mind has been. It's that 2020 season where, seeing that difference here. We've seen, obviously the scramble element where he stretched that yards per carry from the early part of his career with the 4 and 4.1 to that 6.3 and 6.1, where if we can get some of that efficiency in the yards per attempt with more scrambles, but maybe a few less of the designed runs and the short yardage stuff. I'm okay if Latavius Murray and Damien Harris are converting a few more of those 4th and 1s, and we're able to do that. And don't get me wrong, maybe the Bills introduced that tush push we saw from Jalen Hurts and the Eagles. Maybe we see more of that kind of thing, because I think with Josh's size and people like Dawson Knox or Latavius Murray behind him, that's probably a pretty powerful tool. So I won't be upset at that. But if we can dial that back and get back to this initial first 3 years where 89 carries, 109, 102, instead of the 122, 124, I don't want to see us cut that in half and go down to 60, but I'd be okay if it's 90 to 100 carries, and those 90 to 100 carries are still 500, 550, 600 yards instead of the 760 we've been seeing. The key is, can we go back to that 2020 season? And not that there's been a big drop off, because there hasn't, but some of those peaks we hit in that 2020 season, the 69% completion percentage, the 4,500 yards, the 37 touchdowns, and all those were in 16 games. So getting back to that point where the 284 yards per game, the 107 quarterback rating, if we can see a little of that trade-off where we can get some of that efficiency in the passing numbers, maybe he has his first 40 passing touchdown season, but it's a trade-off where it's only 3 or 4 rushing touchdowns. I think that's the kind of thing where he can still be number 1, or like you said, in that tier where if you're not number 1, but it's by 15 points and it's less than 1 point per game over the season, it's not the reason you're winning or losing your championship. He's that buoy, that rising tide that lifts all boats, where you're getting that 25, 30 points over and over and over again with those big, big games. And he's able to kind of help carry you, and you're not having to worry that, hey, he's a top 3 guy and he's going to be the number 1 quarterback in 4 or 5 of the games that season. We're not too worried about it. So I think that's where my vision and goal is. And I think he's shown so much consistency over the last 3 years that when you're throwing that dart at him, and especially this year's, at some places you can get him as the 3rd quarterback off the board. If you know your worst case scenario is that he's quarterback 5 and still within 25 or 30 points of the number 1 guy, it's just a super safe pick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. And I'm right there with that when you're talking, passing up on rushing touchdown upside and now going to passing TD upside. And I think that is the natural trade-off when we talk about, having the running back room that we do have. It still is built in the aggregate where we're going to be a rotational multi-back system. It's not like we have the rumors suggesting potentially Dalvin Cook to the Buffalo Bills. Yeah. Now that story changes, right? But now you got the James Cook, you got the Harris, you got Murray, and you're going to have a rotational piece every now and then in this backfield, splitting carries, removing carries. But I think if you do have a viable running game that defenses are scared of, this is just going to open up the pass game for Josh Allen that much more. And like you said, the efficiency rates in the TD upside is going to be there, because in 2020 it was 37 and it dipped 1 touchdown every single season after that. And coincidentally, his rushing stats continued to rise after that. Yeah. So maybe there's some correlation in that where we can say maybe he, dial it back to 95, 105 rushing attempts in that realm, and then, see what he can do with his arm. He's got added weapons now that we're going to discuss, and it's going to be great.
Yeah, speaking of those weapons, so one of the areas that Aaron and I are usually pretty aligned on most of the things that we think about. And last night or earlier this week, we talked about going through the breakdown of what it's going to look like with this backfield. And I found a couple different areas. I did some analysis here where I went through, I recorded the last 3 years since the offense has been good, how much the lead, second, and third running back have gotten. I kind of averaged it out. We talked here, my whole idea of like shaving off 15% of that from Josh, that he goes from 120 and dials back to the 90 to 100 range. And that I think some of that shifts over here, maybe even some of the goal line work, that you could see more touchdowns from a Harris or Murray converting a few more of those. So I kind of talked about what this could look like. And I then came across, and I wish I could credit it, I found it that someone was looking at some of the, you get in right now, average draft position data is pretty skewed towards the best ball tournaments and a lot of those different ones out there on some of the different sites that run the different contests early on. But it did show that Singletary, good Lord, James Cook and Damien Harris were pretty close later on. And that Aaron, when he did his projection, he wondered, would we see James Cook at 45% of the touches and Damien Harris at 40%, and then the rest of that kind of 15% split between Latavius Murray and Hines. My projection, I kind of kept it at what we saw Singletary getting the last couple years, which was 58 to 60%. And then the secondary guy getting that 38 to 40%. And that I think what's interesting here is, depending on which direction that goes, right now, the perception in the marketplace, you're drafting James Cook closer to Aaron's projection. He's being drafted as though he's going to be a 40 to 40% touch guy. If he ends up getting 55 to 60% of the touches out of a backfield in the Bills that is, very likely to be a top 5 scoring offense in the NFL, I think there's a pocket for value there. So I won't ruin it for the fans, because I saw a bit of what your projection was. Kind of talk through what you foresee right now in, it's the first time the Bills have had a 4-headed backfield. It's the first time we've seen more defined roles. A lot of times we've had guys who are pretty similar and could both do similar things. Now we have guys who, like, you can tell, like Latavius Murray doesn't look like Nyheim Hines, and he can do different things. And we brought in Damien Harris. We can kind of see what we think Harris or Murray might do. And then Cook is more of the all-around guy who can do all the things. where is your mindset at on how you think this could break down? And is there a chance Cook breaks away than maybe more than the 1A, 1B that people seem to have in mind right now?
Yeah, so I think that we gotta take what the coaching staff was saying in this running back room and alluding to the fact that they have to earn it. And speaking of James Cook in particular, he has to earn his touches. And for me, when you go back and when I scouted a James Cook from UGA, I mean, I comped him as a lesser Alvin Kamara. And I think, everything we saw from this past season, it alludes to that. And I think that there is a high level of potential that it could be. When we had a guy like Zach Moss, I mean, we were looking for that, pounder type of guy. Now with a Harris, I think that you can implement maybe a lesser Alvin Kamara, Mark Ingram style from New Orleans here in Buffalo. And I think that would work very well here. The only difference is Harris isn't necessarily your pass catcher, so you're going to leave yourself some tells to the defense to know kind of what you're doing when one of these running backs is in or out of the field, right? James Cook, kind of your Swiss Army knife where you can do both. I do believe as the year begins, we could see more of a split, and we could see, the Bills playing the hot hand. And it might get a little frustrating for James Cook owners because I love the guy. I think he's absolutely lights out. And if he does get the, opportunity, he seems to me a little bit of a volume carrier as well. The 10 to 12 touches in a game, give him like 3 or 4 in a row. He may be able to do something. I mean, we saw it in the Pittsburgh game. His vision is very good. He's got wheels for days. He is that game breaker, kind of like a Travis Etienne type style where he can make a house call at any given moment. Understanding NFL defenses is not an easy thing. So you had to understand he comes from a trio backfield in UGA anyway. So being a lead back isn't necessarily his forte. Maybe he's going to turn into something like a DeAndre Swift type of player. But I do believe that he could take the lion's share of the workload. I had my projection, 180 carries for 990 yards for James Cook. I had Harris at 100 with 450 yards. Murray taking potentially 40 for 170. And then, between Harris and Murray, I had 9 touchdowns where Cook had 5 on the ground. And that's just not accounting his receiving upside. So James Cook could obviously build that TD upside in the receiving game that much more also.
And then this was a little metric that we had shared in DM earlier that, obviously I don't expect it to continue here at the 89 carries that James Cook would just be this ridiculous outlier, but seeing that he was above average in missed tackles forced per attempt and just completely out of this world in the rushing yards over expected, it does show you how much potential there is for the efficiency and the capabilities that are there. And that, whether that goes from 89 carries to, I think at the low end, anyone could project is probably 140 to 150. I can't imagine projecting lower than that for him. And like I said, I have him right at 200. And I think that in that range, I think I'll be a little surprised if he goes way over 200. If he does, we're talking about maybe an injury in the backfield or he just exploded beyond our expectation. But having that kind of range and you see this kind of potential where, you see other guys here, Travis Etienne, DeAndre Swift, Breece Hall, like some of the most explosive running backs in the NFL, and James Cook way up here. It's just ridiculous to be able to think about that potential. And, then, you talked about some of the way that that's going to break down and how that can be set up in the way that it is. I am curious, and I do wonder, are we going to see some of that backfield split out? I had it with Nyheim Hines here, 30 catches for 225 yards. And that most of the short yardage I took away, I didn't have Hines getting a lot of carries. I had more of that with Harris and Murray in that kind of pounder role. I didn't split them out separately. But I had Cook at, 200 carries for 911, 40 catches for 300 yards, 1,200 total yards, 7 total touchdowns. If there's any chance you get a player like that, you're talking about, a big time value from a fantasy standpoint. So, maybe this is the high side of his projection, but, none of this was any kind of guesswork on my side. This is simply what Devin Singletary has done, and then add a small bump in reducing the amount of rushing wear and tear that Josh Allen has. That's all this is. This is basically I would have probably projected Devin Singletary for the same thing if he had stayed and we hadn't picked up Harrison Murray. I think it would have been the same kind of thing, that I would have expected him to keep the 1A, and I would have projected the same kind of season. This is more what I think this backfield can produce, more than some wishful thinking for James Cook specifically.
Yeah, and I can't argue it, because the biggest knock for a James Cook, I'll just add in the point before we move on, is that, it was his size. Could he handle a 200 plus workload, carry load, right? And I mean, the fact that we just brought up the stat saying his missed tackles and his avoided tackles are league tops in that department, I mean, that's an absolute benefit for him.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and like I said, here you had Cook, if his number of carries had qualified, I think the qualifier was at 100, he would have led the NFL in yards per attempt because he had 5.7. So it didn't end up working out that way. But I bring this one up to talk about the receiving group. So obviously you see a lot of these names over here returning, and a couple at the higher end that are not returning. So obviously, Crowder didn't have a ton at the lower end here. Not a lot of turnover there. 8 from Moss, 7 from Kumaro. There's actually a little chunk down here where you're talking about another like 30 or so targets that are players who are gone down at the bottom end. Then you add that into the 65 for McKenzie, that now we're all of a sudden at 100 that are missing. The 52 from Singletary, that's 152 that are missing. So with Stefon Diggs, Gabriel Davis, we know Dawson Knox is there. We'll get to the tight ends here in a minute. What are your expectations on, one, we'll start with Diggs and Davis at 154 and 93. We know what those guys have produced with that level of opportunity that they've had. What is your expectation of where those guys stay versus right now? Obviously, I'll ask the question at the end if we think anybody else is going to be joining this receiver group. Right now, my expectation is that's probably going to be Deontay Hardy. It's probably going to be Trent Sherfield, Khalil Shakir, and that group is the ones who are going to carve out the additional extra receiving role. What's your expectation with this wide receiver room and the way that it's structured now, with what it could divvy out, where we talked about 150 available targets?
Right. So, I mean, I had the same thing. So it was 156 free targets from all the players who departed. For now, I also looked at Josh Allen's last 2 years on average on his passing attempts, plus the target share of all the newcomers on their career highs. And I'm still coming up with 79 free targets in this Bills offense.
I don't want to interrupt. But also, we talked earlier, if we see some of that reversion back to the 2020, there could even be additional targets floating out there on top of the 79 free that you identified.
Absolutely. And I'm only taking career stats for all the new additions, the guys that are returning, and then Josh Allen's 2-year average on attempts. So 79 is just it could be on the low end, like you're saying, and I completely agree with that. When we're talking about Diggs and Davis, so Diggs 154, you got to think it's equal to or less than, 5 to 10 targets around that similar type of, volume. When it comes to Davis, this is the issue that we all have. How many people jumping off the bandwagon for my guy, Gabe, Mr. Alpha, I believe. But I mean, I understand. I get it. He's a frustrating problem right now. Fix the hands, 93 targets. I'm saying equal to or greater than. And if we're talking greater than, I want to see it anywhere from 95 to 105 to potentially 110. This is without a guy named DeAndre Hopkins on this team. But I do believe it's viable in this offense if you give Davis the more opportunity and his catch rate ups even 5% more. He's a 1,000-yard wide receiver on this team.
And I think, we've talked about some of the different pieces. I think his catch rate gets a lot of bad flack because people don't take into account his ADOT, like the average depth of target. And you talk about, every receiver who has a very high ADOT and this 17.4 yards per reception, none of them have a high catch rate because they're high variance plays. You don't have the high completion percentage on those deep shots, but when you have 17.4 yards per attempt, you're getting huge efficiency when he's able to do that. So maybe there's a little trade-off there. Maybe he's not only a deep threat. Maybe Deontay Hardy runs a few more of those clear out routes. Maybe they work a little bit differently from that standpoint. But I think that what that's providing is that opportunity to be able to go in there. I'll ask, out of those available other ones, and you talked about, some of the other career, highs in the career production that we've seen. Do you think there's any possibility that a third or third wide receiver target here has any value? And I guess it would probably have to be Deontay Hardy. Maybe you'd see enough out of a Khalil Shakir that he was able to really take that slot role. We've seen what Trent Sherfield has done in limited opportunities when he stepped in for Tyreek Hill in Miami and had his best receiving season. Do you think there's any chance one of those guys carves out a fantasy relevant role, or are they mainly a handcuff that if something happens to Diggs or Davis, then you'd snag them?
I think at this point, it's likely handcuff roles for most of our wide receivers. You're going to play matchup. I think, and it depends how the Buffalo Bills decide to utilize them. For me, from what we've seen from this coaching staff and this current regime, they tend to give the guys who have been on the squad first crack at losing the job. And I think that Shakir right now is the vet over a Hardy and over a Sherfield. And I think he's going to be given every opportunity to succeed in that role. Hardy's role, to me, and as excited as we all are for the speed aspect, the mismatch ability, we were hoping that, McKenzie was going to be that guy and Hardy might potentially be that guy. Right. So I actually believe that a Shakir could be quite a dominant, slot weapon. But then when you add a guy like Kincaid, it kind of, pulls you back a little bit and said, well, how does he fit into the mix? Because you're kind of double backing on a similar role. But for me, Shakir, 20 targets last year, I got to believe that's going to go up. Is it fantasy relevant and viable this year? Probably not until we see more clarity in how they're going to utilize Kincaid.
So I agree. I'd love to advocate for it. I think that, if you're going to throw a dart on any upside play, maybe you think about the crazy efficiency we saw in that one season with New Orleans. The Deontay, at that point, Deontay Harris had a crazy, yards per target and yards per route run standpoint. That maybe that can be something that can translate. If he were to get the 65 targets that McKenzie got last year, maybe he produces at a higher level than what those were, but I'd be hard pressed to see anyone really carving that out besides our transition into our last position here at the tight end position. So with the tight ends, I'm going to contradict myself, of course. I'm really excited about the addition of Dalton Kincaid. I actually love it from a dynasty standpoint, just because I think there is obviously I'm not going to say Travis Kelce because he's maybe the greatest receiving tight end of all time, but from a high usage, let's say a Mark Andrews, a Dallas Clark, a high top 2 to 3 passing option in one of the best passing offenses in football, you now have, fantasy heaven in the way that can be and what that can be from a weapon standpoint. However, I don't know how you can expect that his rookie year. I just don't know. When you're talking about the greatest rookie tight end seasons ever, and that you still have to reference Mike Ditka, it's really hard to argue with that much history. And I know, we've seen a few with, Evan Ingram and Kyle Pitts, I know got a lot of hard time, but he still had 1,000 yards as a rookie. So still, a lot of production, just the weird red zone issues that he had. So let the people know, one, on the dynasty side, if you share my excitement, and two, do you have any higher hopes for the rookie year, or are you still kind of hedging your bets that side?
So I'm going to say it right now. I got Kincaid in every dynasty league that I'm in.
Love it.
Because you cannot not love it. I mean, for the oxymoron, you can't not love it. It's so good. I mean, okay, when we look at his running fluidity alone, he looks like Travis Kelce. We're not going to compare him to Travis Kelce, but he runs a lot like Travis Kelce. And it's nice to see some similarity in that respect. When we're talking fantasy viability for a rookie tight end. So last year's class, I'll give you just a quick sample size. Okonkwo from the Titans, he was the tight end 24, only scored 81 points, 46 targets, 32 receptions, almost 500 yards. Isaiah Likely, 60 targets, 36 receptions, 373. He finished as tight end 26, 73.3 points. this last tight end class wasn't as good. So we go to 2021, it's Kyle Pitts and it's Pat Freiermuth, who I coined the Muth, and the Muth was the beast. And we knew Kyle Pitts was going to be the dog. We knew he was going to blow up, and that's the outlier. It's an anomaly. It's not the standard when it comes to rookie tight ends. Pat Freiermuth kind of fits that mold of a higher elite talent at the position, 79 targets, 60 receptions, almost 500 yards, 7 touchdowns, 121 in half PPR, tight end 13. And that's Pat Freiermuth. So if we're expecting something from a Dalton Kincaid, we look at even Dawson Knox's career high season where it was 587, 9 touchdowns, 49 receptions. So is it out of the realm of possibilities to believe the Bills could say, okay, Dawson, you're going to play on the line just a little bit more. You're still going to be utilized a lot in the red zone, but a lot of your target share may go to this newcomer in Kincaid from the slot, and he's going to eat up all the target share or majority of your target share plus the free targets. I could easily see, if we do get it right, I know Dorsey was saying, I don't know how we're going to fit him in at this point. It's early, and I think that's coach speak. He's got ideas for days on how to use this man. I think that Kincaid easily could fit into that 65 to 70 target range, be in the 450 to 500, and then his TDs will be anywhere that Knox doesn't take. So that's kind of your split, and you're going to be looking tight end 15 to tight end 12, in my opinion.
I think that's spot on. And I think that the biggest shot for upside is exactly what you brought up with Pat Freiermuth. With tight ends, besides your very, very high end with your Kelsey and your Andrews and your high volume options, everybody else is super touchdown dependent. Well, the one thing that this Bills offense kind of needs is a reliable red zone weapon. The reason we have so much usage with Josh Allen is because we don't have that go-to. We don't have Travis Kelce in the red zone. We don't have that go-to guy. Diggs is an amazing receiver, but he's not like a Kelvin Johnson. He's not Randy Moss. He's not up there just, going up over top and mossing guys in the end zone. He has to have room to work to be able to create separation. And I'm curious with, what we've heard people talk about with that Cole Beasley type role, but with the Dalton Kincaid size, are we going to see his early contributions be most heavily seen in the red zone? And maybe we could see a season where he has some fantasy relevance as a rookie, more on the high impact, high value touches versus high volume, where I don't think there's any scenario where he's a 100 target guy right off the bat. I do think that potential is down the line where he can be a 100 target kind of tight end. But I don't expect that as a rookie. So we'll see where that goes. Before we get you out of here, give the folks your best pitch on why they should subscribe to the Cover One Fantasy channel, check out your content, and how you are going to help lead them to their next fantasy championship.
Awesome, man. So here it is. I'm very different than a lot of fantasy channels who just do start sit. Like I said, I'm a scout as well. I scout all the college football players, get you in the know for your dynasty. I do all dynasty redraft coverage, player scouting analysis, rankings, trends. Like I said, consistency rates are the game changer in fantasy football that a lot of people do not use. My model is pretty stellar at this point, I gotta say, and it's gonna give you a heavy upside on start sit. Nobody's perfect. It is, a lot of people say it's a dart throw with fantasy football, but I'm sitting here telling you it's probably likely 75, 80 to 20, skill to luck when it comes to fantasy football. Follow me over and I'll get you guys some trophies.
I love it. I'm really excited to see it. We've been doing a big push. If you're checking this out right now, check out the link in the bio. Go and subscribe. We've got a lot of fun things coming up here. Really excited about the work that Chris has been doing, and couldn't be prouder to have him associated with the Cover One channel here. So thank you very much for your time tonight. Thank you, all of you guys who are listening to this. You guys have been fantastic. You guys know how the algorithm works. You guys know the things that we need. We need you to go press that like button. We need you to subscribe. That's how you let people know. Give us a comment. Let us know what you're excited about and which Buffalo Bills you're looking forward to draft here this coming fantasy season. But on behalf of Chris Chous, this is Greg Tompsett. You've been listening to the Greg Tompsett Sports Show, and we are out.